You should probably start looking at senior apartments now, my daughter-in-law whispered at my husband's funeral reception while balancing a champagne glass in her hand. My son didn't correct her. He just stared down at the floor as if avoiding my eyes would somehow make her words less cruel. I remember standing there in the corner of the country club ballroom wearing the black dress Thomas bought me for our 40th anniversary, listening to people offer shallow condolences while Brianna Whitmore casually discussed my future like I was an inconvenience that needed to be relocated before the weekend was over. The room smelled faintly of lilies and expensive coffee. Soft piano music floated through the reception hall while guests picked at catered sandwiches and miniature pastries arranged on silver trays. Everyone kept giving me the same sympathetic smile. The kind people reserve for someone they assume is about to lose everything. Poor Eleanor, I heard one of Thomas's cousins whisper near the dessert table. I heard the company was bleeding money near the end. Another voice answered quietly. At least Jason can sell the house quickly before the debts pile up. I lowered my eyes and pretended not to hear them. That was the strange thing about grief. It sharpened your hearing. Every fake whisper sounded louder than church bells. Every sideways glance landed like cold rain against my skin. Thomas had been gone for exactly 3 days, and already people were measuring the remains of my life like bargain hunters at an estate sale. Brianna moved through the room greeting guests, as though she were hosting a holiday cocktail party instead of attending her father-in-law's funeral. Her fitted black dress probably cost more than my first car back in 1978. Every few minutes she touched Jason's arm possessively, steering conversations before he could say too much. We're doing everything we can for Eleanor, she told one woman dramatically. It's going to be such a difficult adjustment for her financially. Financially? I nearly smiled at that word. Earlier that morning, before the funeral service began, I had sat quietly inside Charles Holloway's office while he slid a thick folder across his mahogany desk. Thomas's final documents. Transfer confirmations. Trust agreements. Investment portfolios. $28 million carefully protected under my name alone. Thomas had looked me straight in the eye 6 months earlier when his health first began failing. Don't tell anyone what I've done, he said softly from his hospital bed. Not Jason. Not Brianna. I need to know who loves you when they think there's nothing left to gain. At the time, I told him he was being dramatic. Now, standing inside that ballroom watching my own family slowly erase me from their future, I realized my husband had understood people far better than I ever had. Mom, Jason finally said as he approached me near the coffee station. His voice sounded nervous, thin around the edges. Brianna and I were talking, and maybe after everything settles down, it might be easier if you move somewhere smaller. You know, less maintenance. Less maintenance. As if I were an aging appliance nobody wanted to repair anymore. I looked at my son carefully. At the dark circles beneath his eyes. At the discomfort written across his face. Once upon a time, Jason used to crawl into our bed during thunderstorms because he believed I could protect him from anything. Now he couldn't even protect me from his wife. Brianna appeared beside him with a polished smile. We just want what's best for you, Eleanor. I noticed she had stopped calling me Mom about a year ago. Funny how small changes reveal bigger truths later. I folded my gloved hands calmly in front of me and nodded once. Of course you do, I said quietly. Then I reached for my coffee cup and took a slow sip while either of them realized the woman they were pitying had become richer than anyone else in that room. The house felt unfamiliar after everyone left that evening. Silence settled into the walls in a way I had never experienced before, heavy and unnatural, like the air itself was grieving. Thomas had always filled the rooms without trying. The sound of his footsteps. The scrape of his newspaper against the kitchen table every morning. The low hum of old jazz records drifting from his study after dinner. Now there was only the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway and a faint buzzing from the kitchen refrigerator. I stood alone in the foyer for several minutes after Jason and Brianna drove away, still wearing my black heels and funeral coat because taking them off somehow felt too final. Outside, rain tapped gently against the windows overlooking the front lawn. The porch light reflected across the wet driveway where Thomas used to wash his silver Cadillac every Sunday morning without fail. I finally walked into the kitchen and noticed Brianna had rearranged several things while helping clean after the reception. My coffee mugs had been moved to a different cabinet. The ceramic bowl Thomas brought me from Santa Fe 20 years ago sat crooked near the sink. Even the hand towels were different. Small things. But grief teaches you that small things matter more than anyone realizes. I opened the refrigerator and stared at the trays of leftover food from the funeral reception. Sliced turkey. Potato salad. Lemon bars nobody touched. Brianna had taped a note to one of the aluminum trays in neat handwriting. Remember to throw out anything expired. Expired. I almost laughed at the choice of words. Somewhere upstairs, the floor creaked softly as the old house settled against the wind outside. For a moment I instinctively looked toward the staircase, expecting Thomas to appear wearing his reading glasses and navy robe, asking if there was any pie left. Instead, there was only darkness at the top landing. I pressed one hand against the kitchen counter until the wave of loneliness passed. Then I noticed another change. The framed photograph beside the hallway lamp had disappeared. It was my favorite picture of Thomas and me taken during a trip to Maine in 1994. We were standing near the harbor in Bar Harbor holding lobster rolls and laughing at something I cannot remember anymore. I searched the living room shelves before finally finding the frame turned backward inside a storage box near the laundry room. Carefully wrapped around it were several more photographs. Wedding pictures. Family vacations. Old Christmas cards. Memories packed away less than 20. 4 hours after my husband was buried, my chest tightened slowly. Not because of anger. Anger would have been easier. What I felt instead was the quiet realization that Jason and Brianna were already preparing this house for a future that did not include me. I carried the box upstairs and stopped outside Thomas's study. The door was slightly open. Light from the hallway spilled across his leather chair and the unfinished crossword puzzle still sitting beside his reading lamp. His coffee cup remained exactly where he left it 3 days earlier. Half full. Cold. Untouched. I stepped inside carefully, breathing in the fading scent of sandalwood and paper that always clung to the room. Then I noticed several drawers hanging slightly open in his desk. Someone had gone through them. Slowly. Thoroughly. I knelt beside the bottom drawer and saw the empty space where Thomas kept old financial files. The folders were gone. My stomach sank immediately. Jason and Brianna had been searching already. Looking for account numbers. Insurance papers. Anything they believed might still hold value. I sat quietly in Thomas's chair and stared out the rain-covered window toward the backyard garden he planted the year Sophie was born. Winter had stripped most of the flowers away now, leaving only bare branches trembling in the cold wind. Thomas used to say people revealed themselves most clearly after funerals. Grief removes the performance. He once told me while we attended the memorial service of an old business partner years ago. At the time I thought he sounded cynical. Tonight I understood exactly what he meant. Downstairs, my phone buzzed softly against the kitchen counter. A text message from Brianna appeared on the screen. Jason and I were discussing the house taxes tonight. We should probably meet soon about next steps. Not even 1 full day after the funeral. I stared at the message for several seconds before locking the screen again. Then I walked slowly back into Thomas's study, sat down in the silence, and rested my hand on the folder Charles Holloway had given me that morning containing $28 million nobody in my family knew existed. The next morning, the house felt colder than it had the night before. Pale winter light filtered through the dining room curtains, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors Thomas spent years restoring by hand. I woke before sunrise out of habit, reaching toward the empty side of the bed before reality settled over me again like wet cement. For 42 years, Thomas had started every morning the same way. Black coffee. 2 slices of toast. The business section folded beside his plate. I still made the coffee automatically, even though only 1 cup was needed now. The kitchen smelled familiar for a few brief moments, and that almost made the loneliness worse. I carried my mug into the breakfast nook overlooking the backyard and noticed tire tracks in the driveway's snow. Jason and Brianna had arrived earlier than expected. I glanced at the clock on the microwave. 7:15 in the morning? Nobody visits that early after a funeral unless they want something. The front door opened before I even reached the hallway. Brianna walked in first carrying 2 oversized coffees and a leather folder pressed against her chest. Jason followed behind her with his hands shoved into the pockets of his winter coat. Neither of them looked comfortable. "We brought breakfast," Brianna announced brightly, as though we were planning a cheerful family outing instead of standing inside a grieving widow's home. She set a paper bag on the counter and immediately started opening cabinets without asking, searching for plates. I watched quietly while Jason avoided eye contact again. "You should have called first," I said gently. "We did not want you sitting here alone," Brianna replied too quickly. "Besides, we figured there are important things to organize now." There it was. Not condolences. Not concern. Organization. Jason finally spoke while staring down into his coffee cup. "Mom, Brianna has been helping me look through some of Dad's business paperwork." I nodded once but said nothing. Brianna slid the leather folder across the counter toward me with polished nails and careful movements. "There are a lot of overdue property expenses," she explained. "Utilities, maintenance, taxes. This house is going to become overwhelming very quickly." I opened the folder slowly. Inside were printed spreadsheets, estimated repair costs, and a list of suggested real estate agents highlighted in yellow marker. One page had already been bookmarked beside a paragraph discussing quick sale options for inherited homes. My fingers rested calmly against the paper even as my chest tightened. They had prepared all of this within 48 hours of Thomas being buried. We found several missing financial records in Dad's office. Jason added carefully, "Do you know where he kept account information?" I looked at my son for a long moment before answering. His voice carried the same nervous tone he used as a child whenever he tried hiding broken dishes or poor report cards. But this was different now. This was greed wrapped in politeness. "Thomas handled most investments privately," I replied softly. That part, at least, was true. Brianna exchanged a quick glance with Jason before forcing another smile. "Well, we are just trying to avoid surprises later. Sometimes people think there is more money than there actually is." I nearly admired how skillfully she performed concern. Almost. Sophie wandered downstairs a few moments later wearing fuzzy socks and an oversized sweatshirt, her blonde hair still messy from sleep. At 16, she had Thomas's thoughtful eyes and quiet way of observing a room before speaking. "Grandma," she said softly, wrapping her arms around me without hesitation. It was the first genuine affection I had felt since the funeral. Brianna immediately stiffened. "Sophie, give your grandmother some space." But Sophie ignored her mother and stayed beside me while reaching for a cinnamon roll from the paper bag. "I miss Grandpa," she whispered. I swallowed carefully before nodding. "So do I." The kitchen fell silent for several seconds. Then Brianna cleared her throat and tapped the folder again. "There is also the matter of long-term living arrangements." Long-term living arrangements. Another polished phrase designed to sound compassionate, while meaning something colder underneath. "We found a beautiful retirement community about 30 minutes away," she continued. "Private gardens. Daily activities. Transportation services." She spoke the way real estate agents describe vacation condos. Jason finally looked at me directly. "It might actually be easier for everybody." "Everybody. Not you. Not us. Everybody." I folded the folder closed carefully and slid it back across the counter. "That is very thoughtful," I said quietly. Brianna relaxed slightly, clearly believing I was surrendering already. Then Sophie looked up suddenly from the kitchen table and frowned at her parents. "Grandpa told me Grandma would always stay here," she said innocently. The room froze. Brianna's smile disappeared for half a second before returning sharper than before. "Well, sweetheart, circumstances change." I looked out the frosted kitchen window toward the snow-covered garden Thomas planted years ago, and realized something painful. My granddaughter was the only person in that room still honoring his promises. After Jason and Brianna left that afternoon, I carried the leather folder back into Thomas's study and placed it carefully beside his reading lamp. Snow continued falling outside the windows in soft, silent waves, covering the backyard garden one thin layer at a time. The entire house smelled faintly of coffee and old paper. I stood there for several minutes staring at Thomas's empty chair before finally lowering myself into it. The leather creaked softly beneath me. He used to spend hours in this room balancing business accounts, reading biographies about presidents, or pretending not to notice when I brought him oatmeal cookies after dinner. Sometimes he would glance over the top of his glasses and smile like we shared some private joke the rest of the world could never understand. I missed that smile more than I knew how to survive. My eyes drifted toward the built-in bookshelf near the fireplace where Thomas kept framed family photographs lined in perfect rows. I noticed something immediately. The picture from Jason's college graduation sat pushed farther back than the others, almost hidden behind an old globe. I reached for it slowly. Thomas and I stood beside our son outside Georgetown University almost 20 years earlier. Jason looked young and hopeful then, wearing a Navy graduation robe while gripping his diploma with both hands. Thomas had tears in his eyes that day even though he tried pretending it was just allergies. "He is going to do something meaningful," he whispered to me during the ceremony. "Not just successful. Meaningful." I traced my finger lightly across the dusty frame before setting it back down. Somewhere along the way, success had become the only thing Jason measured anymore. Bigger house. Better neighborhood. Luxury vacations. Investment portfolios. Brianna fit perfectly into that world because she treated life like a competition nobody else realized they were losing. But Thomas saw the change long before I did. About 8 months before his diagnosis, we attended a charity gala downtown hosted by one of his business associates. I remembered standing beside him near the ballroom entrance while Brianna laughed too loudly at a banker's joke across the room. Jason stood nearby nodding along, eager to impress people who barely noticed him. Thomas leaned toward me quietly. "Watch how people behave around money," he murmured. "It tells you everything." At the time I brushed the comment aside because I still believed families operated differently. I believed love protected people from becoming selfish. Looking back now, I realized Thomas had already started preparing for what was coming. My gaze shifted toward the bottom drawer of his desk where Charles Holloway's folder still rested untouched beneath several legal envelopes. Slowly, I pulled it out again. The paperwork inside remained surreal no matter how many times I looked at it. Investment trusts. Commercial property holdings. Offshore accounts. Thomas had spent decades quietly building wealth far beyond anything Jason or Brianna ever suspected. Yet we continued living in the same house, driving sensible cars, eating dinner at local restaurants instead of expensive private clubs. Thomas always said true wealth should provide peace, not performance. Near the back of the folder sat a sealed envelope with my name written across the front in Thomas's familiar handwriting. Eleanor. Just seeing the letters made my throat tighten. Carefully, I opened it and unfolded the note inside. "If you are reading this," he wrote, "then I am already gone, and I know you are trying to make excuses for everyone around you. Please do not. I spent years watching people reveal themselves whenever they believed something valuable was slipping away. I needed to know whether our family still understood loyalty when there was no reward attached to it." My hands trembled slightly as I continued reading. "You once told me kindness means believing the best in people. I hope you never lose that part of yourself. But kindness does not mean surrendering your dignity." I closed my eyes for several seconds after finishing the letter. Downstairs, the grandfather clock chimed 4 times through the silent house. Thomas knew. He knew exactly what Jason and Brianna would become after his death. Maybe not because he distrusted them completely, but because success had slowly taught them to value appearances more than relationships. There was another memory suddenly returning to me now. 3 years earlier during Thanksgiving dinner, Brianna complained openly about elderly neighbors lowering property values because they refused to renovate their homes. Jason laughed uncomfortably while Thomas stared at his plate in silence. Later that night, after everyone left, he stood at the kitchen sink rinsing wine glasses and said quietly, "One day they will mistake patience for weakness." At the time I thought he was talking about business. Now I understood he had been talking about me. 3 days after the funeral, Brianna invited herself over again just before dinner. I heard her heels against the front porch before the doorbell even rang. Outside, the snow had started melting into thin gray slush along the sidewalks, and the bare oak trees lining our street swayed gently beneath a cold January wind. I opened the door to find her standing there holding a bakery box and wearing a cream-colored wool coat that looked too elegant for a casual family visit. "I brought pie," she announced with practiced warmth. "Jason is still at work, but I thought you should not spend the evening alone." I stepped aside quietly and let her in. The house still smelled faintly of Thomas's aftershave and cedarwood from the fireplace. Brianna glanced around the foyer with quick calculating eyes before removing her gloves. It was subtle. Most people probably would not have noticed. But once you understand someone is measuring your life in dollar signs, every glance feels different. She followed me into the kitchen while I prepared tea. For several minutes she made harmless conversation about weather forecasts and Sophie's school schedule. Then, like always, the real purpose of her visit slowly surfaced beneath the politeness. "I spoke with a realtor this morning," she said while carefully cutting slices of apple pie onto dessert plates. "The market is actually strong right now despite interest rates." I stirred my tea without responding immediately. "That is good for sellers," I said softly. Brianna smiled. "Exactly." There was something almost triumphant hidden inside that one word. She leaned lightly against the kitchen island and crossed her arms. "Jason worries about you staying here alone. This house is enormous for one person." I glanced around the kitchen. Thomas and I renovated together 15 years earlier. The pale marble countertops, the brass cabinet handles. Thomas insisted on polishing himself every Christmas. The breakfast nook where Sophie used to do homework while I made grilled cheese sandwiches after school. "It does not feel enormous," I replied quietly. "Not yet." Brianna sighed gently, the way nurses sometimes speak to difficult patients. "Eleanor, I know this is emotional for you. But realistically, maintaining this property is going to become impossible financially." Financially again. Always financially. I watched steam rise slowly from my teacup while memories drifted through my mind. Thomas teaching Sophie how to make pancakes on Sunday mornings. Jason carving pumpkins beside his father in the driveway every October. 42 years of ordinary moments stitched into the walls around me. Brianna sat down across from me and lowered her voice sympathetically. "There is no shame in downsizing. A lot of women your age actually thrive in retirement communities." Women your age. Not mothers. Not widows. Just women your age. I folded my napkin carefully onto the table. "You seem very eager for me to leave." Brianna blinked once before forcing a soft laugh. "That is not fair." But her smile tightened around the edges. "We are trying to help you before things become difficult." I studied her face quietly then. Brianna was beautiful in the polished way magazine advertisements teach women to become beautiful. Perfect hair. Expensive jewelry. Controlled expressions. But underneath all that polish lived a constant hunger. The kind of hunger no amount of money ever truly satisfies. "Thomas never mentioned financial trouble to me," I said calmly. Her eyes sharpened instantly. "Well, men hide things sometimes. Especially pride." There it was again. The assumption. The belief that Thomas died leaving chaos behind. Brianna reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a glossy brochure filled with smiling elderly couples walking beside fountains and flower gardens. "I actually toured this place yesterday," she explained. "The director said they have immediate openings." Immediate openings. I stared at the brochure for several quiet seconds before setting it aside untouched. Upstairs, Floorboards creaked softly as the old house settled against the cold. Brianna followed the sound with her eyes. Honestly, she continued carefully, a fresh start might be healthy. This house probably carries too many memories anyway. Too many memories. I almost smiled at how casually she spoke about erasing an entire lifetime. Before I could answer, headlights swept across the front window. A moment later, Sophie entered through the mudroom carrying a backpack and wearing her school orchestra jacket. Her cheeks were pink from the cold outside. "Grandma," she said brightly before noticing her mother at the table. "Oh." Brianna immediately straightened her posture. "Did your father pick you up from rehearsal?" Sophie nodded while pulling off her gloves. Then her eyes landed on the retirement community brochure beside my teacup. The expression on her face changed instantly. "What is that?" she asked quietly. Brianna answered too quickly. "Just discussing options for Grandma's future." Sophie looked at me instead of her mother. I held her gaze for one silent moment. Sometimes children recognize betrayal faster than adults because they have not yet learned how to disguise it with polite language. Sophie slowly set her backpack on the floor and moved beside my chair. Then, without saying another word, she rested her hand gently on my shoulder while her mother stared at us from across the kitchen table. The following Sunday, Jason insisted on taking me out to dinner. He called twice that afternoon before I finally answered, his voice unusually cheerful in the careful way people sound when they are rehearsing kindness. "Just family," he said. "Nothing stressful." By 6 o'clock, snow clouds had cleared enough to reveal a pale winter sunset stretching across the neighborhood rooftops. Jason picked me up himself, which already felt strange. Normally Brianna handled family plans with military precision, while Jason simply followed her schedule. Tonight he drove in silence most of the way to the restaurant, gripping the steering wheel tightly while soft jazz played through the speakers. I watched streetlights slide across the windshield and wondered how my son had become someone who looked nervous every time he sat beside his own mother. The restaurant overlooked the river downtown, one of those modern places with exposed brick walls, dim amber lighting, and menus printed on heavy cream-colored paper. Brianna was already waiting inside when we arrived, seated at a corner booth with Sophie beside her scrolling quietly through her phone. A bottle of sparkling water sat unopened in the center of the table. Brianna stood immediately when she saw me and kissed my cheek lightly. "Eleanor, you look wonderful tonight." I thanked her politely and slid into the booth across from Sophie. For a while the conversation remained harmless. School schedules. Weather forecasts. A new bakery opening near Brianna's yoga studio. But underneath every polite sentence sat the same invisible tension that had followed us since the funeral. I noticed Jason checking his phone repeatedly. Brianna barely touched her food. Sophie remained unusually quiet. Halfway through dinner, Brianna finally placed her napkin carefully beside her plate and folded her hands together. "We actually wanted to discuss something important tonight." There it was again. Important things always arrived wrapped in soft voices now. Jason cleared his throat awkwardly. "Mom, we have been thinking a lot about your future." I took a slow sip of iced tea before answering. "My future seems very popular lately." Sophie lowered her eyes toward the table. Brianna forced a patient smile. "Please do not make this harder than it needs to be. We are only trying to help." Help. The word had started sounding dangerous in her mouth. Jason pulled several folded documents from inside his jacket pocket and slid them toward me across the table. "These are preliminary housing agreements," he explained carefully. "Nothing official yet." I unfolded the first page slowly. Retirement community brochures. Assisted living payment estimates. Temporary property transfer forms connected to my house. Temporary. Such an innocent-sounding word. "This allows us to manage the property while you transition somewhere smaller," Brianna explained smoothly. "That way bills do not fall behind." I kept reading quietly while waiters moved through the restaurant carrying trays of wine glasses and steaming pasta dishes around us. The entire conversation felt surreal against the soft piano music drifting through the dining room. "You already filled out portions of the paperwork," I observed calmly. Jason shifted uncomfortably. Just to save time. Save time. As though my life had become an administrative inconvenience. Brianna leaned slightly closer across the table. Eleanor, you have to be realistic. Maintaining a 6-bedroom home at your age is irresponsible financially. There it was again. Financially. Every road led back to money with her. Thomas worked very hard for that house, I replied quietly. Brianna's expression tightened almost invisibly. And Jason is trying very hard to protect what is left. What is left? Sophie suddenly looked up from across the table. Mom, she said softly. Grandpa never talked like that. The silence that followed stretched painfully across the booth. Brianna turned toward her daughter with controlled irritation hidden behind her smile. Adults are having a conversation. But Sophie did not back down. Grandpa said Grandma belonged in that house more than anyone. Jason rubbed one hand across his forehead. Sophie, enough. I watched my granddaughter carefully then. Thomas had once told me courage usually appears quietly at first. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just a person refusing to pretend something cruel is normal. Brianna straightened in her seat and lowered her voice. Eleanor, we cannot keep dancing around this. If the financial situation is worse than we think, selling quickly may be your only option. I folded the papers neatly and placed them back on the table between us. Around the restaurant, glasses clinked softly while strangers laughed over dinners and celebrations completely untouched by grief. And if the financial situation is not worse than you think? I asked calmly. Brianna blinked once. Jason looked confused. For the first time all evening, neither of them spoke immediately. I held their silence for several long seconds before sliding the unsigned paperwork back toward my son. I appreciate your concern, I said quietly. But I will not be signing anything tonight. Brianna's smile vanished completely then, and beneath the polished calm on her face, I finally saw it clearly for the first time since Thomas died. Panic. 2 mornings later, I drove downtown to meet Charles Holloway for the formal reading of Thomas's estate documents. The sky hung low and gray above the city, and freezing rain tapped softly against the windshield as traffic crawled through narrow streets lined with office buildings and old brick churches. I wore the same dark wool coat from the funeral and pearl earrings Thomas gave me on our 30th anniversary. Somehow wearing them made me feel steadier. Charles's law office occupied the top floor of a quiet building overlooking the river. The reception area smelled faintly of leather furniture and fresh coffee, the kind of expensive, calm, successful attorneys seem to cultivate naturally. When I stepped off the elevator, I immediately saw Jason and Brianna already waiting near the conference room. Brianna stood beside the window wearing a fitted ivory coat and carrying a structured designer handbag that probably cost more than my first mortgage payment decades ago. Jason sat hunched forward in one of the leather chairs, staring at his phone with exhausted eyes. Sophie sat quietly beside him reading a paperback novel, while swinging one foot nervously beneath her chair. Eleanor. Brianna greeted me with polished warmth that sounded almost rehearsed now. We were beginning to worry. Worry. Another dangerous word. I smiled faintly and removed my gloves. Traffic was slow. Charles Holloway appeared moments later holding a thick stack of folders against his chest. His silver hair looked slightly more disheveled than usual, and there was something unusually careful in his expression when he looked at me. Thank you all for coming, he said quietly before leading us into the conference room. The room itself felt cold despite the expensive mahogany table dominating the center. Rain streaked across the large windows overlooking the river below, while soft yellow lamps cast reflections against polished wood surfaces. Thomas used to conduct business meetings in rooms exactly like this for years. Sitting there now felt strangely intimate, like walking through footprints he left behind. Charles arranged several folders carefully in front of him before folding his hands together. Your husband prepared these estate documents personally over the last 18 months, he explained calmly. Many details remained confidential until today by his direct instruction. I noticed Brianna sit slightly straighter at those words. Jason finally looked up from his phone. Charles opened the first folder. The Whitmore residence, he began, including all surrounding property holdings, transfers entirely to Eleanor Whitmore without conditions. Brianna blinked once. Jason frowned slightly but remained silent. Charles continued turning pages methodically. Several commercial investments and trust accounts established by Thomas Whitmore will also remain under Eleanor Whitmore's sole control. The room grew quieter with each sentence. I could almost hear Brianna calculating numbers in real time behind her carefully composed expression. Then Charles adjusted his glasses and opened the final folder. Additionally, he said evenly, Mr. Whitmore established a protected family trust currently valued at approximately $28 million. Silence. Complete silence. Even the rain outside seemed to disappear for one suspended moment. Jason stared at Charles as though he had misheard him entirely. Brianna's face drained of color so quickly it almost startled me. Sophie slowly lowered her book onto the conference table without taking her eyes off the attorney. $28 million? Jason finally whispered. Charles nodded once. The trust was transferred fully under Eleanor Whitmore's name 6 months ago. Brianna let out a short, nervous laugh that sounded painfully artificial inside the quiet room. There must be some mistake. Thomas's company had losses last year. Charles looked directly at her. Mr. Whitmore strategically liquidated several public holdings while privately expanding others. The family was intentionally unaware of the full scope of his assets. Intentionally unaware. Such polite wording for what Thomas truly did. He tested them. Charles continued reading calmly while Jason sat frozen beside the table. There is also one final clause Mr. Whitmore insisted be included. His voice softened slightly as he unfolded another document. Any beneficiary found attempting to pressure, manipulate, or remove Eleanor Whitmore from her residence through coercive financial influence forfeits all discretionary inheritance rights immediately. Brianna stopped breathing for a second. I saw it happen. A brief flicker of absolute panic crossing her face before she regained control. Jason looked physically ill now, pale beneath the conference room lighting. Dad wrote that? He asked quietly. Charles nodded. Personally. Nobody spoke after that. Sophie slowly turned toward me with wide, uncertain eyes while Brianna stared downward at the polished table's surface as if trying to avoid drowning inside her own thoughts. I folded my gloves carefully in my lap and remained silent. There was no satisfaction in humiliating them. Only sadness. Sadness that Thomas understood this moment would come long before I ever did. Finally Brianna lifted her eyes toward me again, but this time the confidence was gone entirely. Eleanor, she said softly, I think maybe there have been some misunderstandings these past few days. Misunderstandings. I looked at her for a long, quiet moment before answering. No, I said gently. I think everything became very clear. The elevator ride down from Charles Holloway's office felt strangely silent after the estate meeting ended. Nobody seemed to know how to speak anymore. Jason stared at the floor numbers lighting up one by one, while Brianna stood motionless beside him gripping her handbag so tightly her knuckles turned pale beneath the conference room lighting. Sophie quietly slipped her hand into mine before the elevator doors opened onto the lobby. Outside, freezing rain continued falling across the city streets, turning sidewalks silver beneath the afternoon traffic. Charles walked me toward the entrance while the others lingered several steps behind us. Thomas loved you very much, he said softly as he handed me a final sealed envelope. He wanted you protected from more than financial hardship. I nodded slowly because speaking suddenly felt difficult. Protection. That was what all of this really was. Not revenge. Not punishment. Thomas had spent the final months of his life building a shield around me because somewhere deep down he understood exactly how quickly people changed once they believed vulnerability had entered the room. Jason caught up to me near the revolving doors. Mom, he said quietly. His voice sounded smaller now somehow. Younger. Can we talk? Brianna immediately stepped closer beside him. We all just need time to process everything. Process everything. Funny how quickly concern replaced urgency once money entered the conversation. I adjusted my gloves calmly. I think we have all had enough surprises for one day. Brianna forced a strained smile. Eleanor, if we came across too aggressively before, that was never our intention. I looked at her carefully while cold rain tapped against the glass entrance behind us. Just 1 week. Earlier, she had been handing me brochures for retirement facilities while discussing my future like a scheduling inconvenience. Now her entire tone had softened into careful politeness. You seemed very certain about what was best for me, I replied quietly. Jason rubbed both hands across his face tiredly. Mom, we thought Dad left debts behind. We were trying to help. I almost answered immediately. Almost. But then I remembered Thomas sitting beside the fireplace 2 winters ago while quietly studying Jason and Brianna across the dining room table during Christmas dinner. People rarely reveal themselves during comfort, he told me later that night. Watch them during uncertainty. Standing there in the law office lobby, I finally understood what he meant completely. Sophie moved beside me and slipped her arm through mine. Grandma, are you coming home? She asked softly. Home. Such a simple word. Yet nobody else had used it all week. Brianna opened her mouth quickly. Actually, Jason and I thought Eleanor might want some rest before making decisions. Decisions. Everything with her always sounded transactional. I looked down at Sophie's worried face before answering calmly. Yes, sweetheart. I am going home. The drive back felt longer than usual. Rain blurred against the windows while the city slowly disappeared behind us mile by mile. Jason drove in silence. Brianna remained focused on her phone almost the entire ride, typing messages rapidly with tense movements. Sophie sat quietly beside me in the back seat. Every now and then I caught her watching her parents through the rearview mirror with an expression far too mature for 16 years old. When we finally pulled into the driveway, the old house stood glowing softly beneath the porch lights against the gray winter evening. For the first time since Thomas died, it no longer looked fragile to me. It looked patient. Brianna stepped out of the car first and followed me toward the front door. Eleanor, she began carefully. About the property transfer paperwork from dinner the other night. Obviously that was premature. Premature. Another polished replacement for manipulative. I unlocked the front door slowly and stepped inside. Warm air carrying the scent of cedarwood and old books wrapped around me immediately. Thomas's house. My house. Brianna followed me into the foyer, while Jason lingered awkwardly near the doorway. We should probably revisit everything together once emotions settle, she continued softly. After all, we are family. Family? I turned toward her fully then. For several quiet seconds nobody moved. Rain tapped gently against the windows while the grandfather clock echoed through the hallway behind me. Brianna, I said calmly. Family does not start preparing someone for removal before the funeral flowers die. Her face tightened instantly. Jason lowered his eyes toward the hardwood floor. Nobody denied it because nobody could. Sophie quietly disappeared upstairs without a word. Brianna tried once more. We made mistakes. I nodded slowly. Yes. You did. Then I removed my coat carefully and hung it inside the front closet exactly where I had done every winter evening for the past 42 years. Small rituals suddenly felt important again. Steady. Permanent. Jason finally looked up at me with exhausted eyes. What happens now? He asked quietly. I thought about that question for several long moments while staring toward the staircase where family photographs still lined the walls beneath warm yellow light. No, I said softly. I stopped allowing people to mistake my silence for helplessness. 6 months later, spring sunlight poured through the kitchen windows while fresh lavender swayed gently in ceramic pots along the back patio. The house no longer felt heavy with grief the way it had during those first terrible weeks after Thomas died. The sadness still existed, of course. Some losses settle permanently into your bones. But grief had changed shape over time. It no longer crushed the air from my lungs every morning. Instead, it sat quietly beside me like an old scar that only ached when storms rolled in. I stood at the kitchen counter arranging flowers in a glass vase while soft jazz drifted from the living room record player Thomas bought during our trip to Chicago years ago. Outside, the garden had started blooming again. White roses climbed carefully along the fence line while fresh green leaves returned to the maple tree near the driveway. Life continued whether hearts were ready or not. Sophie sat at the breakfast table finishing homework, while occasionally asking me questions about a history essay she was writing. Since the estate meeting, she had started visiting more often on her own. Sometimes she stayed for dinner. Sometimes we baked pies together while talking about school and music and the strange confusion of becoming an adult inside a family learning how to hide things from each other. Jason visited less frequently now. At first he called almost every day, his voice weighed down by guilt and confusion. Then the calls became quieter, less certain. I never ignored him, but I also stopped rescuing him from the consequences of his own choices. That was the hardest lesson Thomas left me with. Loving someone does not require surrendering your dignity every time they disappoint you. Brianna rarely came to the house anymore. After the estate reading, her politeness transformed into careful distance. I heard through mutual friends that she and Jason had been arguing constantly about money, about trust, about what their marriage was supposed to look like now that their future no longer depended on controlling mine. Strangely, I did not hate her. Hate requires emotional energy I no longer wished to waste. What I felt instead was clarity. People reveal themselves eventually. Some through kindness. Others through entitlement. A month earlier, I used part of Thomas's trust to quietly establish a foundation supporting elderly women facing housing insecurity after financial abuse from family members. Nothing flashy. No newspaper interviews or charity galas. Just practical help. Legal services. Temporary housing assistance. Emergency support. Thomas would have approved of that. He always believed money mattered most when it restored dignity instead of displaying status. Charles Holloway helped me organize everything properly. The first time we reviewed the foundation paperwork together, he smiled softly across his office desk and said, "You know, Thomas predicted you would do something meaningful." With this. Meaningful. The same word he once used describing Jason's future before ambition hollowed parts of him out. One quiet Saturday afternoon, Jason appeared unexpectedly at the front door carrying a cardboard bakery box from my favorite pastry shop downtown. He looked older somehow. Tired around the eyes. We sat together on the back patio drinking coffee while spring rain gathered softly over the neighborhood rooftops. For a long time neither of us spoke much. Finally he stared down into his cup and whispered, "I keep thinking about how fast I believe the worst." I watched raindrops slide slowly along the patio railing before answering. Fear changes people. He nodded weakly. No. Greed changes people. Fear just exposes it. Hearing my son say that hurt more than I expected because it sounded exactly like something Thomas would have said. Jason swallowed hard before speaking again. "I do not know if you can forgive me." I looked at him carefully then. The little boy who once built snow forts beside Thomas in this backyard still existed somewhere inside the exhausted man sitting across from me now. Buried. Confused. But not entirely gone. Forgiveness is not the same thing as forgetting, I said quietly. He nodded slowly like someone finally understanding a language he should have learned years earlier. Later that evening after Jason left, I walked through the house turning on lamps one room at a time as dusk settled softly outside. The hallway photographs remained exactly where they belonged. Thomas's study still smelled faintly of cedarwood and old books. In the kitchen, Sophie laughed upstairs while talking on the phone with friends about graduation plans and college applications. Life. Ordinary beautiful life continuing forward again. I paused beside the living room window and looked out toward the garden Thomas planted years ago. For the first time since his death, the silence inside the house no longer felt empty. It felt peaceful. Losing my husband broke my heart. But discovering the truth about the people around me saved whatever remained of it.